Hello everyone, my name is Jackie Risley and today I'll be talking to you all about freezing degrees of freedom and how that concept plays into skill acquisition within motor learning. Specifically today we'll be talking about how that concept plays into teaching the power clean. Nikolai Bernstein, a neurophysiologist and a pioneer within the world of motor learning, developed this concept back in 1967. He describes the concept as an independent components of a control system and various possibilities of its movements. Essentially, every movement, however complex, can be broken down into individual components that can be associated with specific joints and its muscle groups. By freezing those movements, we can concentrate on the joint and its muscle groups without being distracted by the other various muscle groups and joints associated with the complex movement. Within the concept of freezing degrees of freedom, there are two types of freezing. There is the rigid fixation of an individual degrees of freedom, which would basically be talking about a single joint and its associated muscle groups. The other type of freezing would be the rigid coupling between multiple degrees of freedom. This would include potentially the ankle and the knee when performing lower body movements. So for the specific example of the power clean, I would like to discuss its background and what it is used for. The power clean is a technical powerlifting movement that is often used for development of power, speed, core strength, and overall muscular endurance. The power clean is often described as a complex movement, which involves multiple joints and multiple muscle groups. In order to teach this skill, it is imperative that we break this down using the degrees of freedom and freeze those degrees of freedoms in order for the individual to best learn and progress through the movement. In the example of the power clean, and using the concept of freezing degrees of freedom, we'll be breaking down the power clean into 5 distinct components. First, we have the deadlift. Second, the hip thrust. Third, the shrug. Fourth, rotating the elbows under the bar. And finally, dropping under the bar to complete the movement. For the next part of the video, we will demonstrate each of those components and describe how that is completed and how we will progress from one to the next. First component of the power clean, we'll be looking at the deadlift. Specifically, we'll be focused on the lower extremities, the ankle joint, the knee joint, and the hip joint. This will be using the rigid coupling of multiple degrees of freedom. Important things to keep in mind is that we want to keep a straight back. We don't want to arch our back. We want to make sure that we have good form. We want to make sure our knees do not surpass the front of our toes. We don't want to dip our knees in or out and let our ankles roll one way or the other. We want to make sure that all of our upper extremities are essentially frozen. We're not working on anything on the upper portion of our body. All of our focus is in our lower extremities. So we'll get into a starting position as if the bar was in front of us, and we will practice the very first portion, standing up, and then we'll return to the starting position, and we'll stand up, and we will master this motion before proceeding on to the second. The next component of the power clean will be the hip thrust. This is following the deadlift, and this will continue to raise the bar in a vertical fashion. You may use other exercises such as hip thrusts or with weight to improve the hip thrust within the exercise. However, we will focus on the actual movement within the movement of the power clean. So feet shoulder width apart. You're going to slightly bend the knees and perform the hip thrust and open the hips up through that motion. Following through, keeping every other joint frozen, your upper extremities will be frozen, and you will practice the hip and opening the hips up at the top of the deadlift. Once you have mastered the first portion of the hip thrust, we will then practice shifting the weight from the heels of our feet to the balls of our feet, which will then lead us into the next component of the shrug. Practicing this movement, we will freeze your upper body once again. Learning what we used in the last component with the hip thrust, we will continue building on that to move into the motion of the hip thrust into the weight shift. Come up, drive through the heels, rotate forward, and push through and open your hips. Heels, rotate through, balls of your feet, open your hips. Once more. Through your heels, open your hips, into the balls of your feet. The next component following the hip thrust will be the shoulder shrug. This continues the vertical movement of the bar upward to allow for the next component, which is the elbows to rotate underneath the bar. In order to freeze the degrees of freedom for this component, you will now freeze the lower extremities, the ankle, the knee, and the hip bones, and purely focus on your shoulders and your elbows. In order to complete the movement, standing, arms and hands hanging freely, we will roll our shoulders back and pinch as if you were pinching an object between your shoulder blades. You will reset, roll your shoulders back and pinch, and one more time, roll your shoulders back and pinch. The next component after the shrug will be rotating your elbows from this position to this position under the bar. So as the bar travels vertically and it reaches this weightless phase due to the power from the deadlift, the hip thrust, and the shrug, the next position is to then rotate your elbows under the bar in order to catch an innate front rack position. In order to practice this using the concept of degrees of freedom, we will freeze the lower extremities once again, using the elbows and the shoulders and wrists. There will be a bar in front of you. Your hands will be placed at shoulder or slightly outside of shoulder width, palms facing away. In one motion, you will then rotate around the bar into the front rack position. You will reset, rotate around the bar into the front rack position, focusing on the shoulder and elbow movement. For the final phase of the power clean, we'll be learning how to drop underneath the bar. This will be happening simultaneously as you are rotating your elbows underneath the bar. For this degrees of freedom, we will be freezing the upper extremities and focusing on the lower extremities, the hip, the knee, and the ankle joints. Again, another coupling of a multiple degrees of freedom. In order to complete the motion, stand, feet shoulder width apart. In one fluid motion, quickly, you will drop, almost as you're pulling yourself down into the squat position. It is important that you catch yourself with a straight spine as to not prevent overloading with a curved spine when you catch that weight, and ensuring that, again, your ankles are not rolled in or your knees are not rolled in. Doing so will prevent injury in the future when you're adding more weight to the component. Again, drop down as if you are pulling yourself down into the squat position very quickly. Once an individual has mastered the separate degrees of freedom by freezing the components that we've already discussed, you can now couple those movements together and progress through until the entire component is one fluid motion. For example, you can use the deadlift into the hip thrust. I will demonstrate now. Starting in the low starting position over the bar, you will complete the deadlift into the hip thrust. You're focusing on keeping your back straight, knees in a good position, and as you come up, you want to open your hips up, rotating the weight from the balls of your feet, the heels of your feet to the balls of your feet. And lastly, we can create the elbows under the bar and dropping onto the bar in one motion. As previously described in the last part of the video, when we take the movements and we begin coupling them together, that is known as functional coupling. This is part of the unfreezing process and will happen in the later stages of learning once an individual is more comfortable with the broken down portions of the movement. It is important to keep in mind that freezing may be an effective approach to learning a new skill and may be easier for the individual to understand once the larger component is broken down into smaller parts. It may be more inefficient and less powerful than the overall movement due to the breaking down of the joints and them actually working together in the final movement. As you can see, freezing the degrees of freedom is an effective approach to skill acquisition and is helpful in simple tasks such as a single push-up, or it is very effective even in something as complex as the power clean as we have described in this video. The important thing is that the type of skill, the individual's learning type, and the individual skill level is considered when deciding the approach used during skill acquisition. Thank you all for your time. It's been a pleasure, and train hard.